Given that Russia has spent the better part of 4 years fighting a war with Ukraine that it thought it would win in days, you could be forgiven for thinking that Vladimir Putin would be entirely focused on that fight. He isn't. In addition to the Ukraine war, Putin is trying to bully almost every European country into withdrawing support for Ukraine through threats and hybrid warfare tactics. The UK is one of those countries, and it's just reached breaking point. The call has gone out in the UK, and one of the country's leading military chiefs says that it's time to get ready for a fight. Putin thought he had the UK subdued. Instead, he now has to deal with a country that feels that it has to prepare for war. At least that's according to the UK's Air Chief Marshal Sir Richard Knighton, who has delivered an incendiary intervention in which he claims that it's about time that the UK accepts the fact that the Russian threat has grown to the point where it can't be ignored. On December 16th, Sky News published an array of comments made by Knighton that indicate how the defense chief feels about the current state of the UK's war readiness and the threat that Russia poses. Chief among Knighton's claims was that the UK's armed forces will always be part of the first line of defense against Russia, along with its many European NATO allies. However, to ensure that the UK can play its part properly, the nation as a whole needs to accept the reality check that he delivers about Russia. The situation is more dangerous than I have known during my career, and the price of peace is rising, Knighton said to explain the call that he's making. He said that the UK needs to come together to prepare for a fight that seems increasingly likely to happen, especially when compared to the relative peace that was enjoyed before Putin launched the Ukraine invasion. Our response needs to go beyond simply strengthening our armed forces. It needs a whole-of-nation response that builds our defense industrial capacity, grows the skills we need, harnesses the power of the institutions we will need in wartime, and ensures and increases the resilience of society and the infrastructure that supports it, Knighton says. In other words, the UK has to militarize. It also has to accept that everybody in the country has a role to play if Putin does follow through on his seeming ambition to attempt the overthrow of NATO in Europe. Sons and daughters, colleagues, veterans will all have a role to play, Knighton says, before adding, to build, to serve, and if necessary to fight, and more families will know what sacrifice for our nation means. And the only solution that Sky News implies that Knighton wants to see in the UK is something that once existed in the country but was abolished decades ago: national service. Sky News says that Knighton made it a point to mention that it has been around 80 years since the end of World War II, which was the last conflict in which the UK was involved that might look anything like what Russia plans to bring to Europe. Knighton also touched on the national service issue, noting that it has been abolished for 65 years as of December 2025, and the resilience that this service provided to the UK is something that needs to come back. National service has an interesting history in the UK. On its surface, it seems like a basic form of conscription that forced young, able-bodied men to undergo military training. That was certainly part of it, as the UK's National Army Museum highlights in its retrospective on national service. However, there was more to it than that. National service was a form of peacetime conscription that the UK put into place in 1949 to meet the challenges presented in a rapidly changing world in the wake of World War II. The rise of the Soviet Union was among those changes, which is an unsettling echo of what we're seeing from Putin's attempted expansionism today. National service saw the UK call up all able-bodied men aged between 17 and 21 to serve as conscripts for 18 months, though this increased to 2 years upon the advent of the Korean War in 1950. Between its 1949 creation and the final discharges of national service members in 1963, over 2 million of the UK's young men had spent at least 18 months serving in the British Army, Royal Air Force or Royal Navy. Most were posted to one of the UK's garrisons around the world, which was no small feat in the 1950s and 60s. The UK still had the dying embers of its empire to maintain, meaning national service members often ended up in far-flung places like Borneo, Egypt and Malaya. Most oversaw a period in the UK's history where it was transitioning from holding colonies to returning independence to those territories. However, some national service members, especially those sent to countries like Malaya and Kenya, found themselves on the front lines, putting their training into practice in guerrilla wars. National service existed because the UK needed it. Now, Knighton seems to be suggesting that something akin to this old program is required once more. Russia, Knighton says, is getting stronger, and though he notes that UK defense analysts believe that there is just a remote 5% chance of Russia launching a significant direct attack or invasion against the UK, 5% is still 5% too high in Knighton's mind. Anything more than a 0% chance is a cause for concern, and the actions of Russia in Ukraine and Western Europe offer enough causes for concern that the UK has to be prepared for war, even if there is only a small chance of that war happening. My point is that none of us can say with any certainty what the absolute risk might be, and even though simple binary statements might be easy for people to engage with, They risk instilling panic or complacency, Knighton says, before posing the question that forms the crux of his argument. What really matters is the trend. Are the chances of conflict growing? Knighton argued that they are, and he's not the only one who has noticed that Russia is doing things that seem to imply that Putin has more on his agenda than the conquest of Ukraine. The rebuilding of a Russian army that has been drained of manpower and equipment during a brutal war in Ukraine is already underway, according to several outlets. And it seems that this rebuild is only happening because Putin wants to be prepared for future fights once he's done with Ukraine, assuming he ever gets done with Ukraine, of course. If Russia is victorious, the scale of the country's military rebuild is such that Oxford Analytica predicts that it will be completed by 2030. In a May article, Oxford Analytica outright states that Russia plans to build a larger and more capable military that can confront NATO. The outlet points out that for all its faults, the Russian military has spent almost 4 years fighting the kind of war that Putin may want to bring to Europe. That war has also forced Russia to accept the importance of drones in modern warfare far earlier than most European nations, and those drones could end up being the difference maker. Russia has already signaled that it intends to build drones on a massive scale, Oxford Analytica says, and these drones will complement the traditional weapons Russia favors, such as tanks and missiles, rather than replace them. Foreign Policy makes some similar points in a June article where it examines the rebuilding of the Russian military. The outlet says that Russia is investing in a long-term confrontation with what it describes as the collective West, and that the Ukraine invasion shows that Russia won't constrain itself to international law when it comes to waging war. NATO nations, such as the UK, will constrain themselves to such laws, which may be a major advantage for Putin if he does try to expand Russia's reach further. Russia intends to dedicate itself to rebuilding its army in preparation for what it sees as an inevitable conflict with the West. If true, that only lends credence to Knighton's claims that a war between the UK and Russia is more likely than it seems. Interestingly, a December 4th article in the Milwaukee Independent offers numbers to indicate that this anticipation of a Russian rebuild isn't mere theory. It cites an unnamed Russian military blogger who claims that Russia has built between 540 and 630 T-90M main battle tanks since Putin invaded Ukraine, which amounts to between 13 and 15 T-90s per month. However, the outlet adds that Front Intelligence Insight, which is an open-source data analyst, claims that Russia aims to build over 2,000 T-90M, T-90M2 and T-72B3M tanks over the course of the next decade. Add this to the country's existing industrial output, and you see that there is a dedicated plan in place to ensure that Russia has enough tanks to work alongside the drone army we mentioned earlier. Russia may even act before it's ready. The Milwaukee Independent claims that the Institute for the Study of War has stated that Russia's military leaders haven't indicated any intention to delay a fight with NATO until it's rebuilt the Russian military. As short-sighted an approach as that may be, as a weakened Russia seems like a poor match for a resurgent NATO, it does mean that Russia seems increasingly willing to act on the many threats that Putin and his cronies have made, which is Knighton's entire point. A war with Russia may still be a maybe event, but it's also a distinct possibility, and one that is growing with each passing month. The UK's defence chief also offers plenty of figures that further support his argument that Russia may well be planning a war with NATO that would inevitably include the UK. Over the past 20 years, Russia has delivered significant defence reform and investment into what were weak and hollowed-out armed forces, Knighton says, before adding, "The Russian armed forces are now more than 1.1 million strong, consuming more than 7% of GDP and around 40% of government spending, which is a sum that has more than doubled over the last decade. Arguments could be made that Russia's massive military spending is a major detriment that leaves the country teetering on the edge of economic oblivion. We covered the ravaged Russian economy in a video published a couple of weeks ago, so check that out if you want to learn more about Russia's dire financial situation. Still, none of that changes the fact that the spending has happened and that the Russian military has grown enormously. The UK's military, by comparison, has just 70,000 active service members, Sky News reports. Knighton believes that war may be on the horizon. Others in the UK suggest that the war with Russia has already started. One of those people seems to be Blaise Metrovelli, who is now the head of the UK's MI6 intelligence service. In her first public remarks since assuming that position, Metrovelli said that the UK is operating in a space between peace and war, and that the front line is everywhere. Sky News also says that she echoed the general tone of Knighton's statements by noting that it is the responsibility of everybody in the UK to understand the dangers that Russia poses to the country. Conflict is evolving and trust is eroding, just as new technologies spur both competition and dependence, the intelligence chief said. We are being contested from sea to space, from the battlefield to the boardroom, and even our brains as disinformation manipulates our understanding of each other and ourselves, Metrovelli added. This isn't a temporary problem, the MI6 chief says. The hybrid warfare tactics to which she makes vague mentions are ever present and are having a profound effect on the UK and global security. Russia is a bully that uses intimidation, fear-mongering, and hybrid warfare to get its way, both in Ukraine and throughout Europe. I'm talking about cyber attacks on critical infrastructure, drones buzzing airports and bases, aggressive activity in our seas above and below the waves, state-sponsored arson and sabotage, propaganda and influence operations that crack open and exploit fractures within societies, Metrovelli says, all of which are hybrid warfare tactics that Russia is actively using against the UK and its NATO allies. There may not yet be a conventional invasion of the UK to worry about, but the UK still finds itself in a type of war that Putin hopes will whittle away at the country's strength to make it an easier target once a traditional campaign against NATO begins. There are even reports that Putin wants to go further than what he is doing, with the paper claiming that Russia's leader fantasizes about destroying UK cities. In a December 16th article for the outlet, James Rogers claims that Russia sees the UK as a malicious force because it is one of the few countries with the means and desire to oppose Russian policies. Though Rogers notes that the UK has a strong economic base that supports its ability to stand against Russia, he does admit that Russia has stolen a march on the UK in terms of readying itself for war. Again, we see echoes of Knighton's comments, with Rogers taking things a step further by claiming that the past UK government's refusal to rock the Russian boat are now starting to cause issues. In another piece published by the paper just days before Rogers' article, the outlet's security correspondent Richard Holmes also made the case that the UK is already at war with Russia. He highlighted 4 types of incidents, all of which tell us that Putin's hybrid war is well underway, and that these hybrid attacks are likely the foundation that the Kremlin is building for a future war with the UK. Russian spy ships, such as the Yantar, have engaged in several confrontations with the Royal Navy in UK's waters over the past couple of years, Holmes points out. In fact, there has been a 30% increase in these types of incidents during the last 2 years, with the likelihood being that Russia is trying to locate as many of the 45 underseas cables that connects the UK to its allies as it can in preparation for war. Holmes adds that Putin has low-level criminal proxies operating in the UK who are conducting arson and sabotage operations. There is also a cyber warfare campaign to deal with, which has led to many attacks highlighted by the 2024 crippling of the National Health Services systems by a criminal gang that was later revealed to be backed by the Kremlin. Add all of this to an information warfare campaign that sees Russia spread fake news across social media and through certain media outlets, and you already have a series of attacks that are eroding the fabric of UK society. The soldiers may not be marching yet, but Russia is hitting the UK hard, and it needs to be ready for an eventual war, because these hybrid attacks are designed to make Russia's job easier if and when war starts. We should be under no illusions that Russia has a massive, increasingly technically sophisticated, and now highly combat-experienced military, Knighton says. He also adds to the earlier argument about Russia rebuilding its military by noting that the country is developing new weapons systems that could be devastating to the UK. Russia is developing new and destabilizing weapon systems such as nuclear-armed torpedoes and nuclear-powered cruise missiles, putting nuclear weapons in space, Knighton adds. Russia is using its soft power to try to bully the UK. As it does that, it's building its hard power into something that needs to be feared. If Knighton is correct and the UK needs to embrace a collective war-ready mindset, then reinstituting national service, assuming that's on the agenda at all, isn't going to be enough to prepare the country for a war with Russia. Though the UK benefits from its membership in NATO, which also means that it could be both an activator and responder to the Article 5 clause that calls for all NATO members to support any member that experiences an unprovoked attack on its territory, the UK is taking steps to get ready for the fight that it hopes never happens. Ever stronger support of Ukraine is chief on the UK's anti-Russian agenda. This support is more important to the UK than it may seem, as it sends a signal to Putin that Russia's intimidation tactics aren't having the desired effect. Metrovelli made the point clear in her statements, with one line seeming to be directed at the Kremlin. We all continue to face the menace of an aggressive, expansionist and revisionist Russia, seeking to subjugate Ukraine and harass NATO, she said, and the UK is doing more than most to strengthen its support of Ukraine. For instance, the UK is the driving force behind the Coalition of the Willing, which includes over 24 nations and is committed to acting as a reassurance force for Ukraine in the sense that it will guarantee the country's security after the war ends. Though the specific role this coalition could play is still vague, the fact that it exists at all is a testament to the fact that the UK and its coalition allies see the continued support of Ukraine as the best way to stop Putin's expansionism in its tracks. On December 16th, UKR Inform reported that the UK's bark is being matched by its bite, as the country is actively dedicating funds to ensure that its troops are prepared for potential deployment into Ukraine in the future. The UK's Defence Minister John Healey confirms this, stating, "I continue to direct funding to prepare our UK troops and armed forces so that we are ready to deploy when peace comes, with troops on the ground and jets in the air." Speaking about money, the UK is also committed to spending more on its defence than it ever has before. In March, the UK government said that it would raise defence spending to 2.5% of gross domestic product or GDP by 2027, which accelerates previous plans to do so by 3 years. 3 months later, the UK also committed to meeting NATO's new recommendation that its members spend 5% of their GDPs on defence, which the UK says it will be doing by 2035. If Knighton is right about what the future may hold for the UK, these are all steps in the right direction. The UK seems to be collectively preparing for a fight with Russia. The only question now is, will it have done enough to get ready by the time that Putin starts that fight? Even if it hasn't, the UK is doing as much as it can to support Ukraine in its efforts to ensure that Putin's expansionism never goes beyond Ukraine's borders. A quiet transfer of AS-90 howitzers is the latest contribution that the UK has made to Ukraine's war effort, and they promise to add serious firepower to Ukraine's military. Find out more in our video, and remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more in-depth examinations of the comments made by Europe's defense leaders. And thank you, as always, for watching.